The hall went silent the moment Damien Voss raised his hand. Elena Marsh stood in the center of the Crescent Moon gathering hall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the wolves around her could hear it. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on her. The torches along the stone walls flickered, throwing long shadows across the crowd, but none of that mattered. Only the man standing a few feet away mattered. Alpha King Damien Voss, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat that made him look carved from midnight itself, stared at her with an expression she could not read. She had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years of training, 3 years of proving herself worthy, 3 years of believing that if she worked hard enough, she might finally be seen. Tonight was the choosing ceremony, the night the Alpha King selected the woman who would stand beside him as Luna of the Crescent Moon Pack. Elena had told herself not to hope. She had told herself 100 times that hope was dangerous. But standing there, feeling the weight of every gaze, she could not stop her heart from racing. Damien's eyes moved over her once, slowly, and then he spoke. "I reject you." The words landed like a blow. For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. She blinked, waiting for him to say something else, something that would make sense of what he had just said. But he only stared at her, cold and unmoving, as if she were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. "You are not fit to stand beside me," Damien continued, his voice carrying across the hall without effort. "You have no title, no pack standing, nothing that would make you worthy of the crown. I will not humiliate this pack by choosing a girl with no name." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena felt her face burn, felt the tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of everyone who had come to watch her be crowned or cast aside. "You knew this was a possibility," Damien said, softer now, though his words cut just as deep. "I am sorry if you believed otherwise." He turned before she could respond, his coat sweeping behind him as he walked toward the raised platform where the pack elders sat. Elena stood alone in the middle of the hall, surrounded by hundreds of people who had once smiled at her, encouraged her, told her she had a chance. Now those same people looked away, unwilling to meet her eyes, as though her humiliation might somehow become contagious. Lily Grant, Elena's closest friend since childhood, pushed through the crowd and reached her side. "Elena," she whispered, gripping her arm. "Let's go. Let's get you out of here." Elena nodded, unable to speak. She let Lily guide her toward the exit, her legs moving on instinct, while her mind replayed the moment over and over. "I reject you." 3 words that had taken everything from her in an instant. As they reached the doors, Elena glanced back one last time. Damien stood at the front of the hall, his back straight, his expression unreadable. For a fraction of a second, she thought she saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or confusion. But then he turned away, and the doors closed behind her, and Elena told herself it did not matter what she had seen. He had made his choice. He had made it in front of everyone. The walk back to her small house on the edge of pack territory felt endless. Lily talked the whole way, saying things meant to comfort her, but Elena barely heard any of it. Her mind kept circling back to the ceremony, to the moment the bonding ritual had been performed before the rejection, when she had felt something strange pass through her chest. A warmth, a pull. She had thought it was nerves. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. When they reached her house, Lily insisted on staying the night, but Elena told her she needed to be alone. After a long argument, Lily finally agreed to leave, promising to return in the morning. Elena closed the door behind her and sank onto the small wooden chair by the window, staring out at the dark forest beyond the edge of the property. She thought about her mother, who had died when Elena was 16, and how she had always told Elena that she was meant for something greater than the life fate had given her. She thought about her father, who had left before she could even remember his face. She thought about the years she had spent proving herself to a pack that had never truly accepted her, working twice as hard as everyone else just to be considered. And she thought about Damien Voss, the Alpha King who had looked at her like she was nothing. Anger began to replace the humiliation, slow and steady, like a fire catching in dry wood. She would not stay here. She would not spend another day in a place that had made her feel so small. Crescent Moon territory was not the only place in the world. There were other packs, other cities, other lives to build. She had skills. She had determination. She did not need Damien Voss or his crown or his pack to survive. By the time the moon rose high above the trees, Elena had made her decision. She would leave before dawn. Meanwhile, across the territory, in the highest chamber of the Voss stronghold, Damien Voss stood alone by his window, staring out at the same dark forest Elena had been watching only moments before. He had returned to his chambers immediately after the ceremony, dismissing his guards and his advisors, wanting nothing more than silence. But silence did not come. Instead, a strange ache had settled deep in his chest, one that had begun the moment he turned away from Elena in the hall. At first he thought it was simply the exhaustion of the ceremony, the weight of leadership pressing down on him as it always did. But the ache did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper with every passing hour, a pulling sensation that seemed to reach from somewhere inside his ribs, toward the direction Elena had walked. He pressed a hand to his chest, frowning. He had felt nothing like this before. Not in all his years as Alpha King, not through every trial and battle and loss he had endured. This was different. This felt alive, insistent, impossible to ignore. A knock sounded at his door. His advisor, Marcus Doyle, stepped inside without waiting for permission, his expression troubled. "My lord," Marcus said carefully, "the elders are asking about tonight's decision. Some are concerned about how it was handled." Damien did not turn from the window. The decision was necessary. "Perhaps," Marcus said. "But something is wrong. I can see it. What happened during the ceremony?" Damien hesitated. He had felt something during the bonding ritual, a jolt of warmth that had spread through him, the moment his hand touched Elena's during the traditional greeting. He had dismissed it as nothing, a trick of nerves or the pressure of the moment. But now, hours later, with this strange ache refusing to leave him, he was beginning to wonder if he had been wrong. "Marcus," Damien said slowly, "is it possible to feel a mate bond without recognizing it in the moment?" Marcus's eyes widened. "It is rare, but yes. Some bonds do not fully announce themselves until later, especially if the wolf resists the pull, consciously or not. Why do you ask?" Damien did not answer right away. He thought about Elena standing in the center of the hall, her chin lifted despite the humiliation he had forced upon her, her eyes bright with unshed tears she had refused to let fall. He thought about the ache in his chest, growing stronger with every second that passed since she had walked out of his life. "I need to know," Damien said finally, his voice low, "if Elena Marsh's scent has changed since the ceremony." Marcus frowned, clearly confused by the question, but he nodded and left to investigate. Damien remained by the window, his hand still pressed against his chest, dread building inside him with every passing minute. If his suspicion was correct, if the ache he felt was truly the beginning of a mate bond, then he had just publicly rejected the one woman fate had chosen for him, in front of the entire pack, in the cruelest way possible. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but the ache only pulsed harder, as if punishing him for the distance growing between himself and Elena with every passing hour. Alpha Kings were not supposed to feel fear. He had built his reputation on strength, on control, on never showing weakness in front of anyone. But standing alone in his chamber, feeling something ancient and undeniable clawing at his chest, Damien Voss felt something close to panic for the first time in years. Marcus returned 20 minutes later, his face pale. "My lord," he said quietly, "I spoke with the elder who performed the bonding ritual. He confirmed it. The ritual detected a mate bond during the ceremony. He assumed you were already aware, since such bonds are rarely missed by the wolves involved." Damien's jaw tightened. "Why wasn't I told before the rejection?" "He believed you knew," Marcus said. "Everyone assumed the rejection was intentional, a choice made despite the bond, not in ignorance of it." Damien turned from the window at last, his expression darker than Marcus had ever seen it. "Find out where she has gone." "My lord, it is the middle of the night. Surely this can wait until morning." "No," Damien said, his voice sharp enough to end the conversation. "It cannot." But by the time Damien's guards reached Elena's small house at the edge of pack territory, the house was empty. The fire in the hearth had gone cold. Her belongings, what few she owned, were gone. And Elena Marsh, the woman fate had chosen for the Alpha King, had vanished into the night, unaware of the bond that had already begun to change everything. Damien stood in the doorway of her abandoned house, long after his guards had searched every room, staring at the empty space where she once lived. The ache in his chest had not lessened. If anything, standing in the place she had so recently left made it worse, a hollow pulling sensation that seemed to grow with every second she remained out of his reach. For the first time in his life, Damien Voss did not know what to do next. He had spent years building an image of strength and certainty, an alpha king who never faltered, never doubted, never needed anyone. But standing in an empty house that still smelled faintly of her, he understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he had made a mistake he could not undo with an apology or a decree. He had rejected his fated mate in front of his entire pack, and now she was gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees that surrounded the property. Somewhere beyond the boundary of Crescent Moon territory, Elena Marsh was walking away from everything she had ever known, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart broken by the very man now standing in the ruins of the life she had left behind. Neither of them yet understood how deeply their fates were now tied together, nor how far Damien would have to go to find her again. But the bond between them, silent and unbreakable, had already begun its work, and nothing either of them did in the days that followed would be enough to escape it. Elena walked for hours before the sun began to rise, her legs aching, her small bag growing heavier with every mile. She had left the borders of Crescent Moon territory just after midnight, moving quickly through the forest paths she had learned as a child, avoiding the main roads where pack patrols might spot her. She did not look back. She could not afford to look back. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elena had reached the outskirts of Ashford, a small town that sat on neutral ground between three different pack territories. It was known as a safe place for wolves who wanted distance from pack politics, a town where humans and wolves lived side by side, without much attention paid to old titles or bloodlines. Elena had heard about it from traveling merchants over the years, though she had never imagined she would end up here, alone and starting over. She found a small inn near the edge of town and paid for a room using what little money she had saved. The innkeeper, a kind older woman named Margaret, did not ask questions, though her eyes lingered a moment too long on Elena's tired face and red-rimmed eyes. "You look like you've been through something," Margaret said gently, sliding a cup of tea across the counter. "Whatever it was, you're safe here." Elena managed a small, grateful smile, though she said nothing about the ceremony, about the rejection, about the humiliation that had chased her out of the only home she had ever known. She simply thanked Margaret and retreated to her room, where she finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for a long time. She cried for the years she had spent trying to earn a place that was never meant for her. She cried for the future she had imagined and lost in a single sentence. But somewhere in the middle of her tears, something else began to take shape inside her. Something steadier and stronger than grief, anger, determination. A quiet, burning resolve that she would not let this moment define her. By the time she wiped her eyes and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, Elena had made a promise to herself. She would build a life here, on her own terms, without needing anyone's approval. She would never again let herself hope for acceptance from people who saw her as beneath them. She did not yet know that hundreds of miles away, the man who had rejected her was suffering just as much, if not more, from a bond neither of them had chosen, but both of them now carried. Over the following days, Elena settled into a quiet rhythm. She found work at a small bakery near the town square, kneading dough in the early morning hours before the shop opened, learning recipes from the owner, a stout, cheerful man named Walter who never asked about her past. The work was hard. Her hands blistered and sore by the end of each shift, but there was a strange comfort in the simplicity of it. No titles, no expectations, no one looking at her and deciding she was not enough. Lily wrote to her twice during that first week, letters filled with worry and updates about the pack. Elena read them quickly and wrote back short, careful replies, telling Lily she was safe, but revealing little else. She was not ready to talk about what had happened. She was not ready to think about Damien Voss at all. But even as she tried to build a new life, something strange had begun happening to her. At night, she would wake suddenly, her chest aching with a sensation she could not explain, as though something were pulling at her from somewhere deep inside. At first she thought it was simply the stress of everything that had happened, the exhaustion of starting over in an unfamiliar place. But the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing night, an insistent, restless pull that left her staring at the ceiling until dawn. She mentioned it to no one. She did not yet understand what it meant. Back in Crescent Moon territory, Damien Voss was fighting a battle of his own, one far more visible than Elena's quiet nights of restlessness. The mate bond, once ignored, had begun to demand acknowledgement in ways he could not hide from those around him. His temper had grown short. His focus, usually unshakable, had begun to slip during pack meetings. He found himself staring out windows for long stretches of time, his mind wandering toward a woman he had met only once and cruelly discarded. Marcus, ever loyal, watched his alphas decline with growing concern. "You need to find her," he said one evening, as Damien paced the length of his study for what felt like the 100th time that day. "The bond is only going to get worse the longer you wait." "I am aware," Damien said sharply, though there was no real anger behind the words, only frustration directed inward. "But finding her is not simple. She left no trail. My trackers have found nothing." "Then widen the search," Marcus said. "Send word to neighboring territories. Someone will have seen her." Damien stopped pacing and looked at his advisor, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. He had not slept properly since the ceremony. The ache in his chest had grown into something closer to physical pain, a constant reminder of the mistake he had made, and the consequences now unfolding because of it. "I humiliated her in front of everyone," Damien said quietly. "Even if I find her, why would she ever want to see me again?" Marcus did not have an easy answer for that. Instead, he simply said, "You will not know until you try, and the bond will not release either of you until this is resolved, one way or another. You know this." Damien did know it. Every alpha understood the weight of a mate bond, the way it demanded resolution, the way it could weaken a wolf's strength and judgment if left unaddressed for too long. He had seen it happen to others, had heard stories of alphas who lost themselves entirely to the pull of an unclaimed bond. He could not afford to let that happen to him, not with rival packs watching for any sign of weakness in Crescent Moon leadership. But beneath the political concerns, beneath the pressure of his position, there was something else stirring inside Damien, something he was reluctant to name, even to himself. Guilt, not just for the political complications the bond created, but for the way he had treated a woman who had done nothing to deserve the cruelty he had shown her. He thought about the look on her face when he had spoken those words in front of the entire hall. He thought about the way she had lifted her chin, despite the humiliation, refusing to let anyone see her break. There had been strength in that moment, a quiet dignity that he had barely registered at the time, but could not stop thinking about now. "Send trackers to every territory within 100 miles, Damien said finally, his decision made. "I want to know where she is within the week." Marcus nodded and left to carry out the order, leaving Damien alone once more with his thoughts and the ever-present ache that refused to let him rest. He walked to the window, staring out at the same dark forest he had watched the night of the ceremony, and wondered, not for the first time, whether Elena Marsh would ever forgive him for what he had done. He did not yet know how difficult that path would be, nor how many obstacles still stood between him and the fated mate he had so carelessly cast aside. 2 weeks after Elena's disappearance, a tracker named Colin Everett returned to the Voss stronghold, with news that sent Damien rushing from his study before the man had even finished speaking. A young woman matching Elena's description had been seen working at a bakery in Ashford, a neutral town 3 days' travel from Crescent Moon territory. She had been using a different name, keeping to herself, but the description was unmistakable. Damien did not wait for morning. He gathered a small escort, enough for protection, but not so many that he would draw unwanted attention, and set out that same night. Marcus offered to accompany him, but Damien refused, insisting that this was something he needed to do alone. He could not explain why, exactly, except that some instinct deep inside him understood that showing up with an entourage of guards and advisors would only make things worse. If he was going to have any chance of speaking with Elena, of even beginning to make things right, he needed to arrive as a man, not as an alpha king with all the weight and history of his title. The journey took just over 2 days at the fastest pace his wolf could manage, cutting through forests and open plains under cover of darkness to avoid the attention of rival packs who might use the sighting of an unescorted alpha king to their advantage. By the time Damien reached the outskirts of Ashford, exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, but the ache in his chest, the pull that had haunted him since the ceremony, had grown so sharp and insistent that he barely noticed his own fatigue. She was close. He could feel it. He found the bakery just as the sun was beginning to set, its windows glowing warm and golden against the darkening sky. Through the glass, he could see her, moving between the counter and the ovens, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her forearms, a look of quiet focus on her face that he had never seen during their brief encounter at the ceremony. She looked different here, softer, somehow. Despite the exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders, she looked like someone who had found a small measure of peace, and Damien felt a fresh wave of guilt at the thought that he was about to disturb it. He stood outside the bakery for a long moment, uncertain, something he had rarely experienced in his life as a leader accustomed to certainty and command. Finally, he pushed open the door. The small bell above the entrance rang, and Elena looked up automatically, the polite greeting already forming on her lips before she registered who had walked through the door. The moment recognition hit her, her face went pale, and the tray she had been carrying slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter, the bakery owner, appeared from the back room at the sound of the crash, his eyes widening as he took in the tall, imposing figure standing near the entrance. He seemed to sense immediately that something significant was happening, though he could not have known the full weight of what stood between the two people now staring at each other across the small shop. "Elena," Damien said, taking a careful step forward, "I need to speak with you." "No," Elena said, backing away, her hands trembling slightly. "You said everything you needed to say already, in front of the entire pack. I don't need to hear anything else." "Please," Damien said, and something in his voice, some crack in the composed authority she remembered from the ceremony, made Elena pause despite herself. "Just 5 minutes, that is all I ask." Walter stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between them, his expression protective despite the clear danger of standing between an alpha king and whatever business had brought him here. "Elena, do you want me to ask him to leave?" Elena hesitated, torn between the instinct to refuse and something else, some quiet curiosity she resented feeling, about what could possibly have brought Damien Voss all this way, alone, to find her. Finally, she shook her head. "It's all right, Walter. I'll speak with him. Outside." She untied her apron with unsteady hands and led Damien out into the small alley behind the bakery, away from the curious eyes of anyone who might be passing on the main street. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them heavy with everything unsaid. "Why are you here?" Elena finally asked, crossing her arms tightly against her chest, as much to steady herself as to create distance between them. Damien took a breath, searching for the right words, though nothing felt adequate for what he had come to say. "The bonding ritual detected something during the ceremony," he said finally. "A connection between us. I did not recognize it in the moment. I dismissed it as nerves. But it has not faded since that night. If anything, it has grown stronger." Elena's arms tightened around herself, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes, though she fought against it, unwilling to let herself believe what he seemed to be suggesting. "What are you saying?" "You are my fated mate, Elena," Damien said quietly. "I rejected you without knowing, and I have spent every day since trying to find a way to fix what I did." For a long moment, Elena said nothing at all. The revelation settled over her slowly, each piece falling into place. The strange ache she had felt at night since arriving in Ashford, the restless pull that had kept her from sleeping properly for 2 weeks. She had told herself it was stress, exhaustion, the natural consequence of upheaval. She had never once considered that it might be something else entirely. "You rejected me in front of everyone," Elena said finally, her voice trembling with an anger she had been carrying since that night. "You called me unworthy. You humiliated me, in a room full of people who already looked down on me. And now you're telling me that the whole time, I was your mate?" "Yes," Damien admitted, unable to soften the truth even if he wanted to. "I made a mistake, a terrible one. I let pressure from the elders and my own pride cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in a way I cannot undo with an apology. But I am asking you to let me try." Elena shook her head slowly, tears building in her eyes that she refused to let fall in front of him again. "You don't understand what that night cost me. I lost everything. My home, my place in the pack, whatever small respect I had managed to earn over the years. And you're standing here asking me to just accept you now because some ritual says we're connected?" "I am not asking you to accept anything tonight," Damien said, his voice softening further. "I am only asking for a chance to make things right, whatever that takes." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the cold, dismissive man who had rejected her in that hall. She found something different now, something that looked almost like desperation, though she was not yet ready to trust it. 3 years of trying to prove herself worthy to a pack that never truly saw her had taught her caution above all else. "I need time," she said finally. "I can't just forgive you, because fate decided we belong together. That's not how trust works." "Take whatever time you need," Damien said. "I will not force anything, but I would like to stay in Ashford for a while, if you will allow it. Not to pressure you, simply to be near, in case you change your mind about speaking with me again." Elena did not answer right away. The offer surprised her, this show of patience from a man she had expected to demand immediate acceptance, to use his title and authority to pressure her into compliance. Instead, he was asking for nothing more than proximity, a chance to prove himself slowly, without expectation. "Fine," she said at last, though her voice remained guarded. "You can stay, but don't expect anything from me, Damien Voss. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Damien nodded, something like relief passing briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "That is more than I deserve tonight." "Thank you, Elena." She turned and walked back into the bakery without another word, leaving Damien standing alone in the alley, the ache in his chest finally, slightly, beginning to ease now that he was near her again. It was not forgiveness. It was not even the beginning of trust. But it was something, a single thread connecting them despite everything that had happened, and for now, Damien understood that it would have to be enough. Damien found a small room to rent above the town's only tavern, a modest space with a single window overlooking the square, nothing like the grand chambers he was accustomed to at the Voss stronghold. He told himself the discomfort did not matter. What mattered was staying close enough to prove, slowly and without pressure, that he was not the man Elena had encountered in that hall. The following morning, he walked to the bakery just as it opened, though he did not go inside. He stood across the street instead, watching from a distance as Elena moved through the early hours of her shift, unaware at first that he was there. When she noticed him through the window, her expression tightened, but she did not send anyone to chase him away. She simply returned to her work, and Damien took that as permission enough to remain. He repeated this pattern for the next several days, never approaching her directly, never demanding conversation, simply existing nearby, a quiet and steady presence that neither pushed nor retreated. Word spread quickly through the small town about the mysterious stranger who spent his mornings standing outside Walter's bakery, and though most residents did not recognize him as the Alpha King of Crescent Moon, a few travelers passing through eventually did, sparking quiet murmurs that Elena could not entirely avoid hearing. "Is it true?" Lily asked, during one of their now regular letters, having heard rumors of Damien's departure from pack territory. "Is he really there, in Ashford, with you?" Elena's reply was brief and non-committal, though she could not deny the truth of it. Damien was there. He had been there for 6 days now, and despite her best efforts to ignore him, she found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the quiet consistency of it slowly wearing away at the wall she had built around her anger. On the 7th day, as Elena was closing the bakery for the evening, sweeping flour from the wooden floor, while Walter counted the day's earnings, a commotion outside drew her attention. She stepped to the window and saw Damien standing near the edge of the square, surrounded by 3 unfamiliar men who wore the markings of a rival pack she did not recognize. Her instincts, honed by years of pack life despite her outsider status, told her immediately that something was wrong. The men's postures were aggressive, their voices raised just enough for fragments of the conversation to carry across the square. Without thinking, Elena set down her broom and hurried outside, Walter calling after her in confusion. "You have wandered far from your territory, Alpha King," one of the strangers was saying as Elena approached, his tone mocking. "And without your guard, no less. Careless, for a man who wears a crown." I am simply passing through, Damien replied evenly, though Elena could sense the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. This is neutral ground. I have no quarrel with anyone here. Neutral ground, the man repeated, glancing at his companions with an unpleasant smile. How convenient that the great Alpha King remembers such rules only when they benefit him. Elena stopped a short distance away, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat, but something in the way the strangers shifted their attention toward her the moment she arrived told her that her presence had already been noticed, and not in a way that boded well. "And who is this?" the leader of the group asked, his gaze sweeping over her with open curiosity. "A local girl, or something more interesting? We have heard rumors traveling through the region about an Alpha King chasing after an unclaimed mate. Strange behavior for a man of your reputation." Damien's expression darkened, and Elena watched as something shifted in his posture, a subtle change that made him seem suddenly larger, more dangerous, despite his still measured tone. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Now, before this becomes something you regret." The stranger laughed, though there was less confidence in the sound than before. "Careful, my lord. Threats on neutral ground could be seen as a violation of the old treaties. Surely you would not want word reaching the council that the great Alpha King of Crescent Moon started trouble in Ashford." "I am not threatening you," Damien said. "I am simply informing you of the consequences should you continue this conversation." The tension stretched taut between them, and for a moment, Elena feared the situation would escalate into something violent, right there in the middle of the square where anyone could witness it. But after a long, charged silence, the leader of the group finally stepped back, gesturing for his companions to do the same. "We meant no disrespect," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Merely curious about the rumors. We will leave you to your business, Alpha King. For now." The three men disappeared down a side street, leaving Damien and Elena alone in the square as the last light of evening faded from the sky. Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her heart still racing from the confrontation. "Who were they?" she asked, moving closer despite herself. "Scouts, most likely," Damien said, his jaw tight. "From the Blackwood Pack. They have been testing our borders for months, looking for any sign of weakness they can exploit. My absence from Crescent Moon, combined with rumors of an unresolved mate bond, would look exactly like the kind of vulnerability they have been searching for." Elena felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Are you saying I'm in danger because of this bond?" Damien hesitated, clearly reluctant to confirm her fear, but he had promised himself he would not lie to her again, not after everything his dishonesty and pride had already cost them both. "It is possible," he admitted. "An unclaimed mate bond is seen as a weakness by rival packs. If they believe they can use you against me, either to weaken my position or to provoke a conflict, they may attempt something reckless. And you didn't think to warn me about this before you decided to stand outside my workplace every morning?" Elena's voice rose with frustration, fear masking itself as anger, though Damien understood the distinction even if she did not voice it directly. "I did not want to frighten you," he said, "and I did not expect scouts to find us this quickly. I underestimated how much attention my absence would draw." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the empty street where the strangers had disappeared, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. She had come to Ashford to escape pack politics entirely, to build a life free from titles and expectations, and the constant weight of proving herself worthy. Instead, she found herself standing at the center of exactly the kind of danger she had hoped to leave behind. "I need to think," she said finally, stepping back from him. "About all of this, the bond, the danger, everything. Take whatever time you need," Damien said again. The same words he had offered her days before, though this time they carried a new weight, an urgency neither of them could ignore, now that the danger was no longer theoretical. "But please, Elena, be careful. Do not go anywhere alone, until we understand how much of a threat these scouts truly represent." Elena nodded slowly, though the fear in her chest had not fully settled. She turned and walked back toward the bakery, aware of Damien's eyes following her the entire way, and for the first time since arriving in Ashford, she found herself grateful for his presence rather than resentful of it, even as she remained uncertain about everything else between them. That night, as she lay awake in her small room above the bakery, listening to the wind outside her window, Elena found herself thinking not about the rejection that had brought her here, but about the fear in Damien's voice when he had spoken of the danger she now faced. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless in the larger picture of everything that stood between them, but it planted a seed of doubt in the wall of anger she had built so carefully over the past 2 weeks. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally began to claim her, there was more to this man than the cruel words he had spoken in that crowded hall. Perhaps the bond fate had chosen for her was not entirely a curse, but even as the thought formed, she pushed it away, unwilling to let herself hope again so soon, after having that hope so thoroughly destroyed. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with danger from rival packs, and the unresolved pain between them. But one thing had become clear to both Elena and Damien that evening. Whatever happened next, they would not be able to face it apart. The bond that connected them, and the threat now circling around them, had made certain of that. The days that followed the encounter in the square changed the rhythm between Elena and Damien in ways neither of them had anticipated. Where Elena had once ignored his presence outside the bakery, she now found herself glancing toward the window more frequently, some part of her unable to fully relax, until she confirmed he was still there, still watching over her as promised. Walter noticed the shift immediately, though he said nothing directly, only offering Elena knowing looks whenever Damien's tall figure appeared across the street each morning. On the 4th day since the confrontation with the Blackwood Scouts, Walter finally broke his silence. "You should invite him in," he said, sliding a fresh loaf of bread into the display case. "Standing out there all day cannot be comfortable, and frankly, it is bad for business having a brooding stranger loitering outside my shop." Elena rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself.
"He is not loitering. He is being cautious."
"Call it whatever you like," Walter said, "but if the man is going to protect you from rival wolves, he might as well do it with a warm cup of tea in his hand." That evening, after the bakery had closed and the last customers had gone, Elena found herself standing at the door, watching Damien across the street as the sun began to set behind the rooftops of Ashford. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the road toward him. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar after weeks of careful distance between them. "Walter says you're bad for business, standing out here every day like some kind of ghost." A faint smile crossed Damien's face, the first genuine one Elena had seen from him since their reunion. "I would not want to hurt his business," he said, following her across the street and into the warm, flower-scented interior of the bakery. They sat together at a small table near the window, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised them both. Finally, it was Elena who broke it. "Tell me why," she said quietly. "Not the political reasons, not the pressure from your elders. I want to understand what you were actually thinking that night, standing in front of everyone, choosing to hurt me the way you did." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the cup of tea Elena had set in front of him, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from its surface rather than on her face. "My father was betrayed by his mate," he said finally, "before I was born. She left him for another alpha, took half the pack's secrets with her, and nearly destroyed everything he had built. He never fully recovered from it. He raised me to believe that vulnerability, especially toward a mate, was the greatest weakness a leader could show." Elena listened, saying nothing, sensing that interrupting would only make it harder for him to continue. "When I felt something during the bonding ritual," Damien continued, "I panicked, not because of you specifically, but because of everything that feeling represented. A connection I could not control, a vulnerability I had spent my entire life avoiding. And when the elders began questioning your suitability, questioning your lack of title and standing, I saw an easy way out. I told myself that rejecting you was the safe choice, the choice that would protect the pack and protect myself from becoming my father, weakened by a bond he never fully understood." "So you hurt me to protect yourself," Elena said softly, though there was less anger in her voice now than there had been in the alley behind the bakery, replaced by something closer to sad understanding. "Yes," Damien admitted, finally meeting her eyes. "And it was wrong. I understood that the moment I felt the ache begin, the moment I realized what I had thrown away out of fear. I have spent every day since trying to find the courage to do what I should have done in that hall in the first place, to choose you, openly, regardless of what anyone else believes about your worth." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying since the night of the ceremony, beginning to ease, though she was careful not to let it show too openly. Trust, once broken, did not rebuild itself in a single conversation, no matter how honest. "I appreciate you telling me this," she said. "But understanding why you did it does not erase what it cost me. My reputation, my place in the pack. The years I spent trying to prove I belonged somewhere I clearly never truly did." "I know," Damien said, "and I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have explained myself. I only wanted you to understand that my actions came from fear, not from any true belief that you were unworthy. If anything, standing here now, seeing the strength it took for you to walk away and build a new life for yourself, in a place where no one knew your name, I understand more clearly than ever how wrong I was about you that night." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of manipulation, any trace of the calculated coldness she had seen in that crowded hall. She found none, only exhaustion and regret, and something that looked remarkably like hope, carefully guarded but present nonetheless. "I still need time," she said finally. "But thank you for telling me the truth. It matters, even if it doesn't fix everything." Damien nodded, accepting her words without pushing for more, and for the first time since arriving in Ashford, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge slowly being built, plank by careful plank, toward something neither of them could yet name. Over the following 2 weeks, that bridge continued to grow. Damien began joining Elena for meals at the bakery each evening, their conversations gradually shifting from careful, guarded exchanges to something more natural, occasionally even punctuated by genuine laughter. He told her about his childhood, about the weight of leadership thrust upon him at a young age after his father's death, about the loneliness of a position that demanded constant strength and left little room for uncertainty or fear. Elena, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own story, about her mother's death, about growing up without the protection or status that other pack members took for granted, about the quiet determination that had driven her to keep trying, year after year, to prove she belonged somewhere. Neither of them spoke directly about the mate bond during these conversations, both instinctively understanding that pushing too quickly toward that topic risked undoing the fragile trust they were building. But the ache that had once been a source of pain and confusion for both of them had begun, slowly, to feel less like a burden and more like a quiet, steady presence, a reminder of something neither of them fully understood yet, but no longer feared as they once had. Still, the danger from the Blackwood Scouts had not disappeared, only receded into the background of their growing connection, waiting, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. For the moment, it would inevitably return to disrupt the fragile peace they had begun to build. 3 weeks after Damien's arrival in Ashford, a messenger arrived from Crescent Moon territory, carrying urgent news that shattered the fragile calm the two of them had built. Marcus had sent word that Blackwood pack activity had increased significantly along the northern border, with reports of unusual gatherings and coordinated movements that suggested something far more organized than simple scouting. Damien read the letter twice, in the privacy of his rented room above the tavern, his expression growing darker with each line. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. The Blackwood Scouts who had confronted him in the square had clearly reported back what they had witnessed: an alpha king, separated from his pack, distracted by an unresolved mate bond, vulnerable in ways he had never allowed himself to be before. He found Elena at the bakery the next morning, her hands dusted with flour, as she prepared the day's first batch of bread, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something serious had happened.
"What is it?"
she asked, setting down the rolling pin. "Blackwood pack is mobilizing," Damien said, keeping his voice low despite the early hour and the absence of other customers. "Marcus believes they are planning something against Crescent Moon territory, possibly using my absence and the rumors about our bond as justification for an attack." Elena's stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and guilt, though Damien was quick to notice the shift in her expression and equally quick to address it. "This is not your fault," he said firmly. "Blackwood has been searching for an opportunity to challenge Crescent Moon for years. They would have found some excuse eventually. Our situation simply gave them a convenient one." "What happens now?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer, and the thought of it settled heavily in her chest. "I need to return to my territory," Damien said. "Immediately. My pack needs its alpha, especially if Blackwood is truly planning an attack. Elena nodded slowly, though something in her resisted the idea of him leaving now, after everything they had begun to build over the past weeks. She told herself the feeling was simply concern for his safety, nothing more, though some quieter part of her recognized it as something deeper, something she was not yet ready to name. I understand, she said. You should go. I want you to come with me, Damien said, the words rushing out before he could second-guess them. Not as an obligation, and not because the bond demands it. I want you somewhere I can protect you, especially now that Blackwood knows about our connection. Ashford is neutral ground, but that has not stopped them from testing those boundaries already. If they decide you are a target worth pursuing directly, I do not want you facing that alone. Elena hesitated, torn between the independence she had fought so hard to build in Ashford, and the genuine fear that had settled into her chest at the thought of facing rival wolves without any protection at all. Walter, who had been quietly listening from the doorway of the kitchen, stepped forward with an expression of concern that mirrored her own uncertainty. He's right, Elena, Walter said gently. If there's real danger coming, you shouldn't be here alone. This town has protections against pack conflicts, but those protections have limits, especially if Blackwood decides the reward outweighs the risk of breaking the old treaties. Elena looked between Walter and Damien, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Returning to Crescent Moon territory meant stepping back into the world that had humiliated her, facing the same pack members who had watched her rejection without offering a single word of comfort. But staying in Ashford, now that Blackwood had identified her as a potential target, carried its own dangers entirely. I'll come, she said finally, though her voice carried the weight of everything the decision represented. But I'm not doing this as your intended mate, returning to claim her place. I'm doing this because it's the practical choice, given the danger, nothing more. Understood, Damien said, though the small flicker of hope in his eyes suggested he had heard something more in her decision than she had intended to reveal. Thank you, Elena. They departed Ashford 2 days later, traveling with a small escort Damien had summoned from Crescent Moon for additional protection along the journey. Elena said her goodbyes to Walter and Margaret, both of whom promised to keep her room available should she ever wish to return, a small comfort in the uncertainty of everything ahead. The journey back to Crescent Moon territory felt entirely different from Elena's flight weeks earlier. Where she had once walked alone through the forest under cover of darkness, desperate to escape, she now traveled surrounded by guards, seated beside the very man whose rejection had driven her away in the first place. The irony was not lost on her, though she said nothing about it during the long hours of travel. As they crossed back into familiar territory, Elena felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of dread and something else she could not quite name. She was returning not as the humiliated woman who had fled in shame, but as someone Damien was actively trying to protect, someone the entire pack would soon learn was connected to their Alpha King by the unbreakable pull of fate. When they finally arrived at the Voss stronghold, the pack members who witnessed their arrival stared in open shock, whispers spreading quickly through the courtyard as word of Elena's return, and the reasons behind it, began to circulate. Elena kept her chin lifted, refusing to let the stares unsettle her the way they had during the ceremony weeks earlier. She had survived rejection and humiliation once already. She would not let old fears diminish the strength she had rebuilt in her time away. Marcus greeted them at the entrance, his relief at Damien's safe return evident despite the seriousness of the situation they now faced. The scouting reports are worse than we initially thought, he said without preamble, leading them quickly toward the war room where the pack elders had already gathered. Blackwood has been recruiting allies from smaller packs along the border, promising them territory in exchange for support against Crescent Moon. Damien's expression hardened as he absorbed the news, the brief peace of the past weeks, giving way entirely to the demands of leadership once more. How much time do we have? Difficult to say, Marcus admitted, but based on their movements, I would guess days, not weeks. Elena watched as Damien transformed before her eyes, the gentle, honest man who had shared meals with her in Ashford, giving way to the composed, authoritative Alpha King who had once stood before the entire pack and rejected her without hesitation. It was a strange thing to witness, this duality within him, and she found herself wondering which version of Damien Voss was truly the man beneath the crown. But there was little time for such reflection now. with danger closing in from every direction. Crescent Moon territory stood on the edge of conflict, and Elena, whether she wished it or not, now stood at the very center of it, her fate more tightly bound to Damien's than ever before. The war room fell silent as Damien entered, Elena following a step behind him, uncertain of her place among the gathered elders and pack leaders, who now turned to study her with open curiosity and, in some cases, poorly disguised disapproval. Edmund Grant, the eldest of the pack elders and the man who had presided over the bonding ritual weeks earlier, rose from his seat at the head of the table. "My lord," Edmund said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena before returning to Damien. "We did not expect you to bring her here, given the circumstances." "Elena is under my protection," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She stays. Anyone who has concerns about that can address them with me directly." A few murmurs passed among the gathered elders, but none dared voice open objection, the authority in Damien's voice, enough to silence even the most skeptical among them. Elena felt a small swell of gratitude at his firm defense of her presence, though the tension in the room remained palpable, a reminder that acceptance among the pack would not come easily, regardless of the mate bond that connected her to their alpha. Marcus stepped forward, spreading a detailed map across the center of the table. "Blackwood forces have been gathering here," he said, pointing to a location along the northern border, with smaller groups positioned at these secondary points, likely intended as flanking positions, should we attempt a direct confrontation. Damien studied the map carefully, his expression sharpening with the focus of a leader accustomed to strategic thinking. What is their likely objective? Full territorial conquest, or something more limited? "Our scouts believe they intend to strike at vulnerable outposts first," Marcus said, testing our defenses and morale, before committing to a larger assault. If those initial strikes succeed, they may escalate to a direct challenge against Crescent Moon itself. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, strategies debated and revised, defensive positions assigned, messengers dispatched to allied packs requesting support, should the conflict expand beyond Crescent Moon's ability to handle alone. Elena listened silently throughout, absorbing details she had never been privy to during her years as an outsider within the pack, gaining a new appreciation for the complexity and weight of the responsibilities Damien carried daily. As the meeting finally drew to a close and the elders began filing out of the war room, Edmund lingered behind, his expression troubled as he approached Damien and Elena near the doorway. "My lord," Edmund said carefully, "I must ask, given the danger we now face, whether bringing an unclaimed mate into the stronghold at this time is truly wise. Blackwood may see her as an opportunity, a way to strike directly at your resolve and leadership. I am aware of the risk," Damien said, "which is precisely why I intend to ensure Elena's safety is treated with the same priority as the safety of the pack itself." Edmund's gaze shifted toward Elena, his expression softening slightly, though clear skepticism remained. "I do not doubt your intentions, my lord, but the pack remembers the ceremony. Many still question whether this bond is truly as strong as you believe, given how easily it was dismissed that night." The words stung, though Elena refused to let her expression betray it. She had expected skepticism upon her return, had braced herself for the judgment of a pack that had watched her humiliation without protest weeks earlier. Hearing it voiced so directly, however, still carried a fresh sting of pain. "The bond is real," Damien said firmly, before Elena could respond herself. "And the mistake I made that night was mine alone, born from fear and poor judgment, not from any truth about Elena's worth. I will not have her questioned or doubted, because of my failure to recognize what stood in front of me." Edmund studied his alpha for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, perhaps a grudging respect for the conviction in Damien's words, before finally nodding and taking his leave, the war room emptying, until only Damien and Elena remained. "I'm sorry," Damien said quietly, once they were alone. "I should have prepared you better for the reception you would receive here." "I expected it," Elena said, though her voice carried a weariness that betrayed the toll the day had taken on her. "It's not easy, coming back to a place that watched me be humiliated and said nothing." "I know," Damien said, "and I am asking a great deal of you, expecting you to endure that judgment while also facing the possibility of conflict with Blackwood. If you wish to leave, to return to Ashford where you would be safer from pack politics, I would understand." Elena considered his words carefully, weighing the safety of returning to her quiet life at the bakery against the strange, unexpected sense of purpose she had begun to feel since arriving at the stronghold, watching Damien navigate the weight of leadership with a competence and care that surprised her. She thought about Edmund's skepticism, about the whispers that had followed her through the courtyard, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not ready to run from them. "I'm staying," she said finally, "not because the bond demands it, and not because I've forgiven everything that happened, but because running away again would mean letting Blackwood, and everyone here who doubts me, win. I've spent enough of my life proving myself to people who never believed I deserved a place among them. I'm not going to stop now, especially not when real danger is at stake." Something in Damien's expression shifted at her words, a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he did not yet have a name for, though the ache in his chest, the pull that had haunted him since the ceremony, seemed to settle slightly at the certainty in her voice. "Then we face this together," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next." Elena nodded, and for the first time since her humiliation in that crowded hall weeks earlier, she felt something close to solidarity with the man who had once rejected her so cruelly. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with the looming threat of Blackwood's forces and the lingering skepticism of a pack not yet ready to fully accept her. But standing beside Damien in the quiet aftermath of the War Council, Elena understood that whatever challenges awaited them, she would not be facing them alone. Outside the stronghold, beyond the borders of Crescent Moon territory, the gathering storm of Blackwood's ambition continued to build, unaware that the bond they hoped to exploit as a weakness had instead become something far stronger than either Damien or Elena had anticipated, a foundation neither pride nor fear would be able to easily break apart. 3 days after the War Council, a Blackwood raiding party struck one of Crescent Moon's smaller outposts along the eastern border, exactly as Marcus had predicted. The attack was swift and calculated, though thankfully the outpost's defenders had been forewarned enough to minimize losses, driving the raiders back before any lasting damage could be done. Still, the message was clear. Blackwood Pack, led by their ambitious alpha, Julian Kane, was prepared to escalate the conflict, testing Crescent Moon's resolve one strike at a time. Damien spent the following days deep in strategy sessions with his War Council, coordinating defenses, strengthening border patrols, and reaching out to allied packs for potential support should the conflict expand further. Elena, unable to contribute directly to military planning, found other ways to make herself useful, working alongside the healers to prepare medical supplies and organizing provisions for the outposts most likely to face further attacks. It was during one of these long, exhausting days that Lily finally found her way to the stronghold, having heard reports of Elena's return and the growing conflict with Blackwood. The reunion between the two friends was emotional, Lily embracing Elena tightly the moment she saw her. "I was so worried," Lily said, pulling back to study Elena's face. "When you disappeared, I thought I might never see you again, and now you're back, right in the middle of a war." "It wasn't exactly my plan," Elena admitted, managing a tired smile despite the weight of recent days. "But I'm here, and I'm not running this time." Lily's expression turned curious as her gaze shifted meaningfully between Elena and the direction of Damien's study, where he had been locked away in meetings for most of the day. "And the two of you? How are things, really?" Elena hesitated, uncertain how to describe the complicated shift that had occurred between herself and Damien over the past weeks. "Better than I expected," she said finally. "He's not who I thought he was that night in the hall. Or maybe he is, but he's also more than that. It's complicated." "Sounds like it," Lily said, though her tone carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity and support. "For what it's worth, the pack has noticed how differently he's been acting since you left. Distracted, quieter, nothing like the confident alpha everyone was used to seeing. Some of the elders even started whispering that he regretted the rejection almost immediately, though no one dared say it too loudly." The information settled over Elena with a strange comfort, confirmation from an outside source that Damien's remorse had been genuine, visible even to those who had not witnessed his private struggle in Ashford. It did not erase the pain of that night, but it added another layer of understanding to everything that had happened since. That evening, after Lily had returned to her own quarters within the stronghold, Elena found Damien standing alone on a balcony overlooking the training grounds, his expression heavy with the weight of the ongoing conflict. She joined him without a word, standing beside him in comfortable silence as the sun began to set over the distant hills. "The council wants to hold a formal gathering tomorrow," Damien said finally, breaking the silence, "to address the pack directly about the situation with Blackwood, and about our bond. Edmund believes it will help stabilize morale if the pack understands clearly where things stand between us." Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of another public gathering, memories of the ceremony still vivid despite the weeks that had passed. What exactly would this gathering involve? "I intend to publicly acknowledge you as my mate," Damien said, turning to face her fully, not as an obligation forced by circumstance, but as a genuine choice, made openly, and without the mistakes of that first ceremony. "I understand if you are not ready for something like this, given everything that happened. But I wanted you to know my intention, and to ask whether you would be willing to stand beside me." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the political calculation that had driven his rejection weeks earlier, and found instead something that looked remarkably like sincerity, tempered by genuine uncertainty about her answer. "Why now?" she asked. "Why not wait until the conflict with Blackwood is resolved?" "Because I do not want to wait any longer to make things right," Damien said. "I made the mistake of letting fear and pride dictate my actions once already, and it cost us both dearly. I refuse to make that mistake again, regardless of what challenges we face. If Blackwood believes our bond is a weakness to exploit, then let them see instead how strong that bond truly is." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, the last remnants of her guarded anger softening further in the face of his conviction. She thought about the weeks in Ashford, about the honesty he had shown her, about the quiet, steady presence he had maintained, without ever pressuring her into forgiveness she was not ready to offer. She thought about the strength it had taken to walk away from her old life and build something new, and the equal strength it now took to consider stepping back into a role she had once believed impossible for someone like her. "I'm not ready to call myself your Luna," she said carefully. "Not yet. There's still healing that needs to happen between us, and I won't pretend that everything is resolved simply because we're choosing to stand together publicly. But I am willing to stand beside you tomorrow, as your acknowledged mate, if that's what you're asking." "That is exactly what I am asking," Damien said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, Elena. I know this is not easy, given everything that came before." "No," Elena admitted. "It's not easy. But maybe that's all right. Maybe some things are worth the difficulty." The following day, the pack gathered once more in the same hall where Elena had faced her humiliation weeks earlier. Though the atmosphere felt entirely different this time, Damien stood before the assembled crowd, Elena at his side, and spoke with a clarity and conviction that left no room for doubt about his intentions. "Weeks ago, in this very hall, I made a grave mistake," Damien began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I rejected a woman fate had chosen for me, driven by fear and pride rather than truth. That mistake cost us both greatly, and it is one I intend to spend the rest of my life correcting. Elena Marsh is my fated mate. I acknowledge that bond today, openly and without hesitation, and I ask this pack to extend to her the respect and support she has always deserved." A murmur passed through the crowd, though this time it carried something different from the whispers of judgment Elena remembered from before. There was surprise, certainly, but also a growing sense of respect, as pack members who had witnessed Damien's transformation over the past weeks began to understand the sincerity behind his words. Elena stood tall beside him, refusing to let old fears diminish this moment, and as she looked out over the crowd, she felt something she had not expected to feel again after her humiliation weeks earlier. Acceptance, however tentative, beginning to take root among the very people who had once looked away from her pain. But even as the pack absorbed this new understanding, the looming threat of Blackwood's ambition remained unresolved, a storm gathering strength beyond the borders of Crescent Moon territory, waiting for the moment it would inevitably break upon them all. A week after the public acknowledgement, word arrived that Julian Kane, alpha of the Blackwood pack, had issued a formal challenge against Damien's leadership, invoking an old tradition that allowed rival alphas to contest territorial disputes through direct confrontation rather than prolonged conflict between packs. The challenge cited Damien's earlier rejection of Elena and his subsequent reversal as evidence of weak and unstable leadership, unfit to hold Crescent Moon territory. The War Council convened immediately, tension thick in the room, as the elders debated the implications of the challenge. Edmund, ever cautious, urged careful consideration. A formal challenge cannot be ignored without significant loss of standing, he explained, but it also carries risk. Julian Kane is known for his strength and cunning. This will not be an easy contest. Refusing the challenge would confirm every doubt Blackwood has tried to plant about my leadership, Damien said, his expression resolute despite the gravity of the situation. I will accept. Elena, seated near the back of the war room, felt a cold fear settle into her chest at the thought of Damien facing a direct physical confrontation with a rival alpha, the outcome of which could determine not only his life, but the future of the entire pack, and by extension, her own place within it. She said nothing during the council meeting, understanding that such decisions fell outside her authority to influence, but the fear lingered long after the meeting concluded. That night, she found Damien in the training yard, practicing alone under the light of the moon, his movements sharp and precise as he ran through combat forms he had likely practiced countless times before. She watched from the shadows for a while before finally stepping forward. "You could lose," she said quietly, once he noticed her presence and paused his training. "I could," Damien admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Julian Kane is a formidable opponent, but refusing the challenge guarantees a different kind of loss, one that would leave Crescent Moon vulnerable to further aggression regardless of the outcome. I don't want to lose you," Elena said, the words escaping before she could fully consider them, surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise Damien. "Not now, not after everything we've been through to get here." Damien crossed the distance between them, his expression softening at the vulnerability in her admission. "I do not intend to lose," he said gently. "But I appreciate hearing that you would care if I did." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she did not retreat from the moment, some part of her finally ready to acknowledge feelings she had been carefully guarding since their reunion in Ashford. "I care more than I probably should, given everything that happened between us." "Then perhaps," Damien said quietly, "we are finally on equal footing, both of us caring more than pride would prefer to admit." The days leading up to the formal challenge passed in a blur of preparation, Damien training relentlessly, while Elena found herself increasingly drawn into pack life, working alongside Lily and the other pack members to prepare for whatever outcome awaited them. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, a natural talent for organizing resources and rallying morale among the anxious pack members, skills she had never had the opportunity to develop during her years as an overlooked outsider. On the morning of the challenge, the entire pack gathered at the edge of Crescent Moon territory, where Julian Kane and a contingent of Blackwood wolves had arrived to witness the confrontation. Julian was an imposing figure, tall and heavily built, with cold eyes that studied Damien with open contempt as the two alphas faced each other across the clearing. "I had expected you might send a substitute," Julian said mockingly, "given how distracted you have been by domestic matters." "I fight my own battles," Damien replied evenly, refusing to rise to the provocation. "Let us proceed." The challenge, according to tradition, would be settled through combat in wolf form, the two alphas facing each other without weapons, relying solely on strength, speed, and strategy. Elena watched from the front of the gathered crowd, her heart pounding as both men shifted into their wolf forms, Damien's dark gray coat contrasting sharply against Julian's near-black fur. The battle that followed was fierce and brutal, both wolves circling and striking with calculated precision, testing each other's defenses before committing to more aggressive assaults. Elena watched with her heart in her throat as Julian landed a solid strike against Damien's shoulder, drawing blood and forcing him back several steps, the crowd gasping collectively at the sight. But Damien recovered quickly, using the momentary opening to press his own attack, driving Julian back toward the edge of the clearing with a series of swift, calculated strikes. The battle continued for what felt like an eternity to Elena, each exchange carrying the weight of everything that hung in the balance, the future of Crescent Moon territory, the safety of the pack, and the fragile future she and Damien had only just begun to build together. Finally, after a particularly fierce exchange, Damien managed to pin Julian to the ground, his teeth bared at the rival alpha's throat in the traditional gesture of victory, though he did not deliver the final killing strike that tradition would have permitted. Julian, recognizing his defeat, went still beneath him, acknowledging the loss. Damien shifted back to his human form, standing tall despite the wounds he had sustained during the battle, and addressed the gathered crowd, both Crescent Moon and Blackwood Wolves alike. This challenge is resolved. Crescent Moon territory remains under my leadership, and I expect Blackwood Pack to respect the boundaries our ancestors established generations ago. Julian, humiliated but bound by tradition to honor the outcome, rose slowly and nodded, though his expression remained bitter. The challenge is yours, Alpha Voss. Blackwood will honor the boundary, for now. As the Blackwood contingent departed, the Crescent Moon Pack erupted into celebration, relief and pride evident on every face as they gathered around their victorious Alpha. Elena pushed through the crowd, ignoring propriety entirely as she reached Damien's side, checking the wound on his shoulder with trembling hands. "You're hurt," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is nothing serious," Damien said, though he did not pull away from her careful examination. "Elena, I know," she said softly, cutting off whatever he had intended to say, her own emotions finally breaking through the careful walls she had maintained for so long. "I was so afraid I might lose you, before we ever had the chance to truly begin." Damien reached out, gently cupping her face in his hand, uncaring of the crowd still gathered around them, uncaring of anything, except the woman standing before him who had somehow, despite every mistake he had made, found her way back to his side. "You will not lose me, Elena. Not now. Not ever again." The pack watched in stunned silence, as their Alpha King, victorious and wounded, leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Elena's forehead, a public display of affection and commitment that left no doubt in anyone's mind about the true nature of the bond between them. Whatever skepticism had lingered since her return had finally begun to dissolve, replaced by a growing recognition that the fated mate their Alpha had once so cruelly rejected had, through strength and patience, earned her rightful place among them after all. In the weeks following the defeat of Julian Kane, peace settled over Crescent Moon territory in a way it had not known for months. The Blackwood Pack retreated fully behind their own borders, their ambitions checked for the time being, though everyone understood that lasting peace between rival packs required more than a single victory to secure. Still, for the first time since Elena's humiliation at the original ceremony, the future felt bright with possibility, rather than heavy with uncertainty. Elena's wounds, both physical and emotional, healed slowly in the months that followed. She spent her days working alongside Lily and the other pack members, gradually earning genuine respect through her competence and dedication, rather than the reluctant tolerance she had endured during her earlier years within the pack. Edmund, once her most vocal skeptic, became one of her strongest supporters, impressed by the resilience and grace with which she had navigated everything the pack had put her through. Damien, for his part, worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that his initial rejection had shattered, not only with Elena but with the pack as a whole, demonstrating through consistent action that the fear and pride which had once driven his poor decisions no longer held the same power over him. He consulted Elena on important decisions, valued her perspective in ways that surprised even the elders who had known him longest, and made clear through every action that his commitment to her was permanent, not merely a political necessity born from an unbreakable bond. One evening, nearly 6 months after Elena's return to Crescent Moon territory, Damien requested that the pack gather once more in the Great Hall, the same space that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and her eventual acknowledgement as his mate. Elena felt a familiar flutter of nerves as she prepared for the gathering, though this time the anxiety carried an entirely different quality, anticipation mixed with quiet hope rather than dread. The hall was filled to capacity when Elena entered, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that Lily had helped her select for the occasion, though she still did not know the exact purpose of the gathering. Damien stood at the front of the hall, dressed in formal attire, his expression carrying a warmth and openness entirely different from the cold composure she remembered from her first ceremony. 6 months ago, Damien began, once the hall had settled into silence, I stood in this very place and made the greatest mistake of my life, driven by fear that I mistook for wisdom and pride that I mistook for strength. I rejected the woman fate had chosen for me, causing her pain that I can never fully undo, no matter how many years I spend trying to make amends. Elena felt tears building in her eyes as she listened, the weight of the memory still powerful even now. though tempered by everything that had grown between them since that painful night. But Elena Marsh did something I never expected, Damien continued, his eyes finding hers across the crowded hall. She survived that rejection with more grace and strength than I deserved to witness. She built a new life for herself when I gave her every reason to believe she had nothing left. And when danger threatened this pack, threatened everything we hold dear, she chose to stand beside me anyway, not because fate demanded it, but because she chose to, again and again, despite every reason I gave her to walk away. He crossed the hall to where Elena stood, taking her hands in his expression carrying none of the guardedness that had once defined him. Elena, I am not asking you to accept a title or a crown today. I am asking you to accept me, fully and completely, as the man who loves you, who will spend every day proving worthy of the bond fate gave us, regardless of the mistakes of our past. Elena felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, though these carried none of the pain of that first ceremony, only overwhelming joy at the sincerity in his words and the journey that had brought them both to this moment. I accept you, Damien Voss, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. Not because of fate, and not because of any title, because you have shown me, again and again, that you are worth the trust I once believed I could never give you again. The hall erupted into celebration as Damien pulled Elena into his arms, the pack witnessing not a formal ceremony bound by tradition and obligation, but a genuine union built on honesty, growth, and hard-earned trust. Edmund stepped forward once the celebration had settled slightly, addressing the crowd with a formality that carried genuine warmth. Let it be known throughout Crescent Moon territory, he announced, that Elena Marsh is recognized not merely as the fated mate of our Alpha King, but as our true Luna, earned through strength, patience, and unwavering resilience in the face of every obstacle placed before her. The pack cheered, and Elena, standing beside Damien, with tears of joy still drying on her cheeks, felt for the first time in her life a sense of true belonging, not granted through birthright or title, but earned through every difficult step of the journey that had led her to this moment. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Damien and Elena stepped out onto the same balcony where he had once told her of the challenge against Blackwood, the stars bright above the quiet territory that was now, fully and completely, their shared home. Do you regret any of it? Damien asked quietly, watching her profile in the moonlight. The pain, the uncertainty, everything that brought us to this point? Elena considered the question carefully before answering, her mind drifting back over the months since that painful ceremony, through her time in Ashford, through the danger and growth that had followed her return to Crescent Moon. I regret the pain, she said finally, but not the journey. Everything that happened, even the hardest parts, brought us here, to something real and earned, rather than simply given. I would not trade that for an easier path that led somewhere less true. Damien pulled her closer, resting his chin gently atop her head as they looked out over the territory together, the future stretching before them bright with possibility, despite the challenges that undoubtedly still lay ahead. Then I am grateful for every difficult step, he said softly, because it led me to you, exactly as you are, exactly as fate intended. Below them, the pack continued their celebration long into the night, honoring not just the union of their Alpha King and his fated mate, but the remarkable journey of a woman who had once been publicly rejected and cast aside, only to rise, through her own strength and determination, into the true and rightful Luna of Crescent Moon Pack. And as the stars shone brightly over the territory, Elena Marsh finally understood that everything she had endured had not diminished her worth, but revealed it, undeniable and unbreakable, exactly as fate had always intended.